May 27, 1940, a shallow trench outside Cassel, northern France. Lance Corporal William Hayes of the 2nd Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment, pressed his back against the muddy wall and listened to the sound that made his blood run cold. Bootsteps, dozens of them, getting closer. His Vickers machine gun lay 15 yards away in the Overrun position, its water-cooling jacket shattered by a mortar round. The rest of his section was gone, dead, wounded, or pulled back in the chaotic fighting that had consumed this tiny Belgian crossroads for the past 6 hours. Hayes had stayed behind with the wounded, dragging them one by one into a communication trench, while German infantry swept through the village above. The boots stopped. Hayes could hear German voices now, sharp and efficient, calling out to each other as they cleared the position. His hands found the Bren gun he'd salvaged from a destroyed carrier, 30 rounds in the magazine, maybe another 40 scattered in pouches taken from dead men. Not enough, never enough. Through a gap in the sandbags, he watched Feldgrau uniforms moving through the smoke. 20 men, maybe more. They were consolidating, grouping up where his machine gun post had been, setting up their own position to cover the crossroads. They thought the position was clear. They thought the British had retreated. Hayes looked down at the Bren gun in his hands, then at the 3 wounded men behind him who couldn't walk, couldn't fight, couldn't run. What happened in the next 40 seconds would be studied in British infantry training manuals for the next 80 years. A textbook example of what one man with initiative and a light machine gun could accomplish against impossible odds. For 17 days, the British Expeditionary Force had been fighting a losing battle across France and Belgium. What began on May 10th as a German offensive through the Low Countries had become, by late May, a desperate Allied retreat toward the Channel ports. The Dunkirk evacuation was already underway, but not every unit had received withdrawal orders. Some, like the 2nd Gloucesters, had been designated as rear guard, tasked with holding key positions while hundreds of thousands of British and French troops escaped encirclement. Cassel itself was a small market town perched on a hill overlooking the Flanders Plain, chosen for defense precisely because it dominated the approaches to Dunkirk 30 kilometers away. If German forces seized Cassel, they could bring the evacuation beaches under artillery fire and trap the BEF against the sea. The Gloucesters had been holding the town for 3 days against elements of the German 6th and 8th Panzer divisions, veteran mechanized units that had sliced through French defenses with terrifying efficiency. By May 27th, the situation was critical. German forces had broken through the outer perimeter and were fighting house to house in the town itself. The battalion's machine gun, positions critical for controlling the approach roads, were being systematically overrun. The Vickers medium machine gun had been the backbone of British defensive doctrine since 1914, capable of sustained fire that could break up infantry assaults from 1,000 yards. But the Vickers weighed 40 pounds without its tripod and required a 3-man crew to operate effectively. When positions collapsed under German assault, the heavy guns became anchors that tied crews to their posts. Most Vickers teams died where they set up. British infantry sections in 1940 each carried 1 Bren light machine gun, a Czech-designed weapon that fired the same .303 British round as the standard Lee Enfield rifle. The Bren weighed 23 pounds loaded, could be fired from the shoulder and put out 500 rounds per minute from its distinctive top-mounted curved magazine. It was reliable, accurate, and mobile. What it wasn't was powerful enough to stop a determined German assault by itself. German infantry doctrine emphasized combined arms assault, infantry, mortars, and machine guns working together to suppress defenders, while assault teams closed with grenades and submachine guns. The German MG-34 machine gun fired 900 rounds per minute, nearly twice the Bren's rate, and German squads were built around the machine gun rather than treating it as a support weapon. When German infantry attacked a position, they came with overwhelming firepower designed to pin defenders in place while assault teams maneuvered. Veterans of the French campaign described the sensation of being under German attack as being inside a steel storm. The sheer volume of fire made movement impossible, made thinking difficult, made survival a matter of luck rather than skill. British doctrine called for machine gunners to hold their positions and maintain fire discipline, conserving ammunition for critical moments. But when a position was overrun, doctrine said nothing. There was no training manual for what to do when your Vickers was destroyed. Your section was gone, and German infantry were standing 15 yards away, reorganizing on ground they thought was secure. Lance Corporal Hayes had been in France for 7 months. He'd trained on the Bren gun, fired thousands of rounds on ranges in England, learned the manual of arms until he could strip and reassemble the weapon blindfolded. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this moment. Outnumbered, outgunned, with wounded men depending on him, and no orders coming from anyone because there was no one left to give them. The statistics backed up the terror. By the end of the Dunkirk evacuation, the BEF would leave behind 2,172 artillery pieces, 63,079 vehicles, 76,000 tons of ammunition, and 416,000 tons of supplies. The 2nd Gloucesters would suffer 70% casualties. Most of those losses would come from men like Hayes, rear guard troops who stayed behind to buy time measured in minutes and hours, rather than days. German assault doctrine in 1940 was built on confidence earned through conquest. In 6 weeks, Wehrmacht forces had accomplished what the Imperial German Army couldn't achieve in 4 years. They'd shattered French defenses, overrun Belgium and Holland, and driven the British back to the sea. The infantry tactics that achieved this success were methodical and proven. Clear the position with fire and grenades. Consolidate. Move forward. Repeat. When German infantry overran a British machine gun post, they followed procedure. Suppress the position with MG-34 fire. Close with grenade teams. Neutralize resistance. The system worked because British defenders, pinned by superior firepower and facing assault from multiple directions, typically withdrew or surrendered rather than fight to annihilation. Holding ground was honorable. Dying for already lost ground was futile. The Germans moving through Hayes's former position had every reason to believe it was secure. They'd watched the Vickers gun crew go silent after the mortar strike. They'd swept through the position and found it abandoned. British doctrine called for withdrawal when a position became untenable, and this position, isolated, its heavy weapon destroyed, its supporting positions already overrun, was the definition of untenable. What German infantry commanders understood about British defensive psychology in 1940 was this. British soldiers fought stubbornly when they had clear orders, established positions, and fire support. They crumbled when those structures broke down. The French campaign had proven it repeatedly. Break the defensive line, isolate the units, and British formations would retreat to reform rather than fight as scattered individuals. It was rational, it was professional, it was predictable. Records from German 6th Panzer Division after-action reports describe the Cassel fighting as fierce but conventional. British units defended their assigned sectors until outflanked, then withdrew under covering fire. Machine gun positions were particularly predictable. They would maintain fire until the last moment, then the crews would disable their weapons and fall back. The Germans had developed efficient tactics for clearing these positions precisely because British defenders followed doctrine so reliably. The problem with doctrine is that it assumes soldiers know they're beaten. It assumes they've received orders to withdraw. It assumes they're thinking tactically about survival and military cohesion, rather than about the wounded men lying in a trench behind them, who will be captured or killed if the position isn't held. Hayes had no orders, no radio contact, no supporting units, no way to know that the battalion was already pulling back to secondary positions, that holding this crossroads another 10 minutes meant nothing to the larger defensive plan. He only knew that German infantry were reorganizing 20 yards away, that wounded men were depending on him, and that the Bren gun in his hands had 30 rounds in the magazine. Then came a moment that no training manual predicted, no tactical doctrine covered, and no German assault procedure anticipated. Hayes made a decision that violated every principle of fire discipline, ammunition conservation, and tactical withdrawal that British infantry had drilled into him. He decided not to wait. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the British defense at Dunkirk. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about the Gloucestershire Regiment's stand at Cassel before, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II infantry combat. Hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Lance Corporal William Hayes was 24 years old, a butcher's apprentice from Gloucester before the war, not a natural soldier. He'd been promoted to Lance Corporal 6 weeks earlier when his section leader took shrapnel in the leg during a German air attack. The promotion came with no additional training, no leadership course, just 2 stripes sewn hastily onto his battle dress and an expectation that he'd figure it out. The Bren gun weighed 23 pounds. Hayes lifted it to his shoulder and rose above the edge of the trench. The German infantry were 15 yards away. 22 men by Hayes's count clustered in and around the destroyed machine gun position. Several had unslung their Mauser 98K rifles and were leaning them against the sandbags. Others were passing a water bottle. A Feldwebel, a sergeant, was gesturing toward the crossroads, organizing his squad for the next push. They'd done this 100 times. They were professionals, and this was simply the next objective to clear. Hayes fired. The Bren gun's cyclic rate was 500 rounds per minute, 8 rounds per second. At 15 yards, Hayes didn't aim at individuals. He swept the weapon left to right across the entire position in a continuous burst that emptied the 30-round magazine in less than 4 seconds. The .303 British round wasn't designed for stopping power. It was designed to wound, to disable, to put soldiers out of action without necessarily killing them. At 15 yards, that distinction disappeared. The German infantry were clustered tightly, exactly how assault doctrine said to consolidate after clearing a position. Hayes's burst caught at least 12 men before they understood they were under fire. The Bren gun's magazine locked open. Hayes dropped below the trench edge, his hands already moving. The magazine release. New magazine from the pouch. Slap it into place. Pull the charging handle. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Above him, he could hear shouting, confused and angry. Then return fire. The German MG-34 that opened up sounded like tearing canvas, 900 rounds per minute chewing. Through the sandbags above Hayes's position, rifle rounds cracked overhead. A stick grenade detonated close enough that dirt rained down into the trench. The Germans had recovered from surprise and were doing exactly what their training demanded. Suppress the threat, fix the position, close with assault teams. Hayes counted to 3, rose, fired again. This time the Germans were moving, diving for cover, returning fire. Hayes's second burst was less effective, maybe 3 hits, maybe 4, but it drove the assault teams back, forced them to find cover instead of closing on his position. He dropped again, changed magazines again, and heard something that made his chest tighten. The MG-34 had shifted fire. It wasn't shooting at his position anymore. It was shooting past him into the communication trench where the wounded men lay. Hayes came up a 3rd time. The MG-34 team was 25 yards away now, relocated to better cover, the gunner traversing fire across what he thought was a British fallback route. Hayes put a full magazine into their position. He saw the gunner pitch backward, saw the weapon go silent, then rifle fire from 5 different positions forced him down again. His hands found another magazine. This was the problem with the Bren gun. 30 rounds went fast in sustained fire, and changing magazines under fire turned seconds into vulnerabilities. The Vickers gun he'd lost could fire for minutes without stopping, belts feeding through until the barrel needed changing. The Bren gave him 4 seconds of fire followed by 4 seconds of reloading, and in those gaps, German infantry could move, could flank, could close the distance. Hayes's 4th magazine went into suppressing a grenade team that had worked to within 10 yards of his position. His 5th targeted riflemen who were trying to establish a firing line. His 6th, the charging handle stuck. Stoppage. Every machine gunner's nightmare. Hayes dropped into the trench and tilted the weapon. A spent casing was jammed in the ejection port, the fresh round behind it unable to feed. His training kicked in. Tap, rack, assess. He slapped the magazine, pulled the charging handle twice, cleared the jam. 7 seconds, maybe 8. 8 seconds was enough for German infantry doctrine to work. While Hayes cleared his weapon, an assault team had closed to grenade range. He heard the distinctive metallic sound of a stick grenade's cap being unscrewed. Then the throw. The grenade landed short, detonating in the edge of the trench, 5 yards from Hayes's position. Shrapnel peppered the walls. One fragment caught Hayes in the left shoulder, a hot punch that spun him against the trench wall. He kept hold of the Bren gun. He fired his 7th magazine one-handed, from a kneeling position, emptying it toward where he'd seen the grenade come from. He didn't know if he hit anyone. Didn't matter. What mattered was keeping fire on the position, keeping the Germans from organizing, keeping them from realizing he was alone. His 8th magazine, his 9th. The pouches were getting lighter. He was running low. Then behind him, Hayes heard something that changed everything. British voices, not German, British. His battalion's withdrawal had reached this sector, and a platoon from another company was moving through the communication trenches toward the secondary defensive line. They heard the Bren gun. They heard the German return fire. And they did what British infantry did. They reinforced the position that was still fighting. Within 2 minutes, 15 men from B Company had formed a firing line along Hayes's trench. Within 5 minutes, a lieutenant had established a proper defensive position with overlapping fields of fire. Within 10 minutes, the German assault that had been seconds from overrunning Hayes's position had been driven back with heavy casualties. The crossroads held for another 4 hours before the Gloucesters finally received orders to withdraw to the coast. The after-action reports from the 2nd Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment's defense of Cassel, didn't focus on individual actions. The battalion lost 270 of 400 men during the fighting, and most of those losses went unrecorded in the chaos of evacuation. But B Company's lieutenant made a point of documenting what he found when his platoon reached Hayes's position. 18 German casualties in a 30-yard radius, most concentrated around the destroyed Vickers post. Forensic evidence suggested a single Bren gun firing from one position had inflicted most of the casualties before B Company arrived. The British Army studied machine gun doctrine intensely after Dunkirk. The loss of so much heavy equipment, including virtually every Vickers gun the BEF possessed, meant infantry battalions would need to rely more heavily on light machine guns in future operations. The Bren gun's performance in France became critical data. What emerged from these studies was a revelation about defensive psychology and firepower doctrine. The Vickers gun was designed for sustained defensive fire, holding ground through volume of fire and discouraging enemy assault through mechanical persistence. The Bren gun was designed as a squad support weapon, providing mobile fire support for infantry advance. But at Cassel and dozens of other rearguard actions, the Bren had demonstrated an unexpected capability: aggressive defensive fire. The key was initiative. British doctrine in 1940 emphasized fire discipline, conserving ammunition, engaging targets at range. This worked magnificently when defending prepared positions, with established fields of fire and ammunition resupply. It failed catastrophically when positions collapsed and doctrine provided no guidance for the moment after Overrun. Hayes's action violated every principle of fire discipline. He'd expended 9 30-round magazines, 270 rounds, in approximately 2 minutes of sustained fire. Training. Manuals called this wasteful, unsustainable, tactically unsound. But what the manuals hadn't calculated was the psychological impact of sudden, unexpected fire from a supposedly cleared position. German assault doctrine was methodical precisely because it worked against defenders who fought conventionally. Hayes didn't fight conventionally. He exploited the 60-second window between the Germans, clearing his position and organizing their next advance. Intelligence analysis after Dunkirk revealed something that changed British understanding of German assault tactics. Wehrmacht infantry were trained to consolidate after clearing a position precisely because their doctrine emphasized methodical advance. That consolidation, clustering together, unsling weapons, organize for the next objective, created a moment of maximum vulnerability, a moment that lasted less than a minute, but a minute when trained infantry became targets. The lesson was codified in revised British infantry training manuals by late 1941. Section leaders were instructed that if a position was overrun but not occupied, and if friendly forces still held adjacent ground, the correct response was not withdrawal, but immediate counterattack with maximum firepower. The term that emerged was aggressive defense, using mobility and initiative to exploit enemy doctrine. The Bren gun became the weapon of choice for this tactic. Its combination of firepower, reliability, and mobility made it effective for the kind of short-range, high-intensity engagements that characterized collapsing defensive positions. Where the Vickers required 3 men and preparation, the Bren required 1 man and initiative. By 1944, British infantry doctrine had evolved to emphasize Bren gun employment in ways unthinkable in 1940. Section tactics called for aggressive fire from unexpected positions, exploiting German tendencies to consolidate and organize methodically. The weapon that began the war as a support tool ended it as a primary infantry weapon, with over 30,000 produced by war's end. Most critically, the doctrine recognized something that Hayes understood instinctively. Sometimes the most important moment to open fire isn't when the enemy is approaching, but when they think they've already won. Lance Corporal William Hayes survived the defense of Cassel. He was evacuated from Dunkirk on June 2, 1940, aboard a destroyer that took him to Dover with 900 other exhausted soldiers. The shrapnel wound in his shoulder healed, leaving a scar he carried for the rest of his life. He was promoted to sergeant, assigned to a training battalion, and spent the next 2 years teaching new recruits how to use the Bren gun. He never spoke much about Cassel. When instructors asked him to describe combat conditions, he focused on the mechanical details: magazine changes, stoppages, sight picture. He didn't mention the German infantry reorganizing in the destroyed position, the wounded men behind him in the trench, or the decision to fire instead of withdraw. Some things weren't reducible to training manual language. The 2nd Battalion Gloucestershire Regiment was reformed after Dunkirk and went on to fight in North Africa, Italy, and Northwest Europe. The battalion's defense of Cassel was officially recognized as one of the critical actions that bought time for the Dunkirk evacuation. The 48th Division's stand in Cassel delayed German forces long enough for an additional 35,000 troops to reach the beaches. The cost was enormous, but the mathematics of war cared only about what was saved, not what was spent. British infantry tactics after 1940 reflected hard lessons learned in France. The emphasis on defensive doctrine gave way to recognition that modern warfare demanded initiative at the lowest levels. Section leaders like Hayes, men who made tactical decisions without orders, without support, based purely on immediate battlefield assessment, became the model for a new generation of British infantry leadership. The Bren gun itself became legendary. Canadian production supplemented British manufacturing, producing variants that served not just British forces, but resistance fighters across occupied Europe. The weapon's reliability made it valuable beyond its raw specifications. It worked in mud, it worked in desert sand, it worked after being dropped, submerged, or fired until the barrel glowed red. By war's end, the Bren had become synonymous with British infantry, in the same way the M1 Garand defined American soldiers or the PPSH-41 defined Soviet forces. Post-war analysis of German casualties during the French campaign revealed unexpected patterns. Wehrmacht forces took disproportionately higher losses during the final phase of the campaign, May 20th through June 4th, when Allied forces were conducting fighting withdrawals to the Channel ports. German after-action reports attributed these losses to fanatic British resistance during rearguard actions. The reality was less dramatic. British troops weren't fighting fanatically. They were fighting with initiative, exploiting momentary advantages, using mobility and firepower to disrupt German assault doctrine's methodical progression. The mathematics told the story. One man with a Bren gun, attacking at the precise moment when enemy infantry were consolidating rather than prepared for contact, could inflict casualties equivalent to an entire platoon in defensive positions. The window was narrow, 60 seconds, maybe less. But in those 60 seconds, initiative mattered more than firepower. Surprise mattered more than numbers, and action mattered more than doctrine. Hayes understood this instinctively. The British Army learned it systematically, and German infantry faced it repeatedly for the next 5 years. The difference between a soldier and a leader isn't rank or training. It's the willingness to act when doctrine provides no answers, and when waiting for orders means accepting outcomes you refuse to accept. Hayes had no tactical advantage that May afternoon outside Cassel. No superior position, no supporting fire, no numerical strength. What he had was understanding that German infantry consolidating after clearing a position were vulnerable in ways their doctrine didn't account for. Understanding that 60 seconds of aggressive fire could disrupt an assault that methodical fire would only delay. And understanding that sometimes survival depends less on following the manual than on recognizing the manual's limitations. British infantry doctrine in 1940 was built for the last war. It emphasized the machine gun as a defensive tool, fire discipline as a virtue, and withdrawal as a rational response to untenable positions. Hayes ignored all of it, not from ignorance but from necessity. The wounded men behind him, the crossroads that needed holding, the German infantry who thought they'd already won. These realities mattered more than doctrine. One shallow trench, one Bren gun, one man who decided that overrun and lost weren't synonyms. The position held not because it was defensible by the manual's standards, but because Hayes refused to treat doctrine as destiny. Sometimes the most important weapon a soldier carries isn't the machine gun in his hands. It's the willingness to decide that impossible odds are someone else's problem to worry about. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.